In this video, I'm going to show you how you can repurpose some of your old kits so that you can paint up your very own Predator rack for your Kill Team games.
That the entirety of the cosmos is accessible through each and every individual's mind, connecting to the great mind, the great spirit.
Welcome back to the channel, collectors. So if you are in the hobby for long enough, you would know that you would have already purchased too much grey and sometimes you just don't know what to do with them. So for me, I somehow had some rhinos or predators lying around and I was talking to myself and thinking that I will never ever have them painted because these are kind of abandoned projects, because once upon a time I had aspirations of painting my very own Space Marine army. Like that is ever gonna happen. So with all these kits lying around, I thought that it would be such a waste to sell them, so why not let's just repurpose them into terrain pieces that I can actually use in my Q Team games. So before I blabber on even more about the concept, why not head on and sign up for the newsletter. Links will be in the description below. It's completely free and you get content sent right to your email. Okay, enough about that. So let's talk about the concept of how I intend to paint up this Predator rack. So for the Predator rack, I really want it to blend in seamlessly with the Kill Team terrain. I want it to look kinda generic so that it can link up with all the other terrains that I've painted, like the Sector Imperialis, and soon I'm going to be painting up some Mechanicus terrain, such as the Ferrotonic Incinerator. I would like to add some dirt and soil onto this to give the context that the Rhino or Predator has been crashed and sand and dirt has been building up over some time. This gives me an opportunity to really lay on the weathering and showcase a little bit of how this Predator looked in its heyday. So how I'm going to be approaching this is I'm going to be starting off with the construction. I'm going to be using really cheap air dry clay, and after that we're going to do some airbrushing to get the colors on straight, and I'll be showing you how to use chipping medium. Thereafter, we're going to do some true metallic metals, and I'm going to show you how to weather down this Predator even more. So if you're ready for this quick and easy terrain project, let's get to constructing this Predator rack right now. Welcome to the first chapter of this video where we'll be constructing this Predator rack. So for this stage, I'll be using air dry clay so that I can create some volumes. And don't worry, because I know it looks kind of weird just with the air dry clay, because after that we're going to use some terrain paste to fill in some of the gaps. So for this stage, you also need something for the air dry clay or the Predator to rest on. I can recommend you to use some plastic card or even some cardboard that is left over from a previous project. For me, I'll be using some PVA foam because it's easy to carve and it's flat. This allows me to quickly and easily produce this base. So in summary, these are the materials that I'll be using for this stage. Alright, so let's gather up all these materials and let's get constructing this Predator rack right now. Okay, so right here I'm just going to be using a permanent marker and I'm just going to mark out the rough profile of the rack that I'm trying to create on this PVA foam board. Okay, so I'm trying to make the shape pretty irregular, so when the dirt mound is being built, it doesn't look like a standardized piece on the terrain. Okay, so now with the shape being drawn out, I'm just going to be using a pair of normal scissors. I'm just going to cut out the shape. Don't worry, at this point of time you can just do it very roughly because the next stage we can always use a knife to clean it up. Okay, just want to do this stage pretty fast, just cut out the stuff, and I'm just going to be using the knife to cut out the outlines. Notice that I'm cutting at an angle so that this provides a slanted edge. Okay, so now that the board is done, I'm going to be starting to position the Predator onto the base. I'm just going to be slapping on some air dry clay, softened with a little bit of water as the initial mound of dirt, and then I'm just going to build it up with little blocks of it. Here's a tip for using any form of soft medium that dries over time. Always try to build it in little pieces rather than one whole big piece, because I find that this allows the medium to retain more strength and not break off as a large part. So now that the Predator rack has been constructed, we're just going to prime it and we're going to start airbrushing. For the airbrushing stage, we are going to just apply a base coat and some highlights. Remember, if you don't have an airbrush, that's okay. check out this video right here of how you can use overbrushing to replace the airbrushing stage so that you can achieve a very similar effect. So for this stage, I'll be using these colors right here. Alternatively, these colors will work just fine. So let's get out all these colors and let's get airbrushing this Predator rack right now. So now that I've primed the entire model in Crayon Camo Brown, I'm starting to use a little bit of AK Dark Rust and I'm just doing it as a random pattern all over the area. So this point of time, what I'm trying to create is we are trying to create this under rusting effect because we're going to be using the chipping medium later. So you just want to do this in random patches because this will eventually show it in the chipping and you don't want all the chipping to have a uniform color. So you just want to build this up randomly in thin layers. Don't worry if you've made a mistake because this step actually allows you to be pretty messy. So as we paint up this rusty Predator, we also must remember that rust isn't a uniform color and you just want to build this up over very thin layers. So next, moving up the value scale, I'm using medium rust from AK Gen 3 and I'm just spraying in a little bit here and there, mostly focusing on the areas that will be more exposed to the environment. So as you can see, when I'm spraying this, I move my hand quite a little bit and this is to create the squiggly lines that will ensure that this entire surface looks as ununiform as possible. Lastly, I'm going to go on to light rust. This is done a lot more selectively and sometimes I try to go over both areas in small little concentrated bursts so that this makes the entire surface look very ununiform. So now that the rust layer is done, I'm going to be using AK chipping fluid. This chipping fluid is acrylic based. So what it does is it creates this sort of vulnerable layer that can be activated with water. This can be replaced using the salt and hairspray technique. But that's going to be, just quite a lot more unpredictable. I find that AK chipping fluid tends to be very predictable and you can always control the amount of chipping pretty easily. So next up, I'm going to be using amethyst blue to just spray over the entire surface. For the chipping medium, you really want to start spraying on some paint the moment it's fully dried. The chipping medium works best if it's activated quickly. You don't want to wait for a day or two because the chipping medium will really harden up and you find that it's going to be really hard to activate the chipping medium subsequently. So now that the base color of the blue is done, we're going to start spraying on some AK Generation 3 Ultramarine. Okay, I'm aiming for this to have a sort of top right hand corner lighting. So where I'm trying to focus on is, I'm focusing on the top right hand corner of the model, trying to create a nice thick and even coat in these areas, and I'm trying to create the edges in some modulation. Okay, next I'm going to add ultramarine blue, a little bit of sky blue, a little bit of radiant flash. This is going to create this warm highlight that will contrast against the cool base that we have painted just now. If you notice that this is a very high value and this will stand out very nicely from the cracks that we'll be producing in just a little bit. So now with the airbrushing done, we're going to activate the chipping medium that we have applied earlier. So for this stage, you just need a brush and some water. Alright, so let's get out these materials and let's get chipping on the rhino right now. So here comes the fun part. with a wet brush and a little bit of water. You just need to apply it over the entire model, and this activates the shipping medium. Sometimes you just have to scratch it a little bit harder, and then the paints after the shipping medium will start falling off. There we have it. You see, there's a big brown patch on the top of the cupola. If you don't have chipping medium, one alternative that you can do is you can always be doing some sponging. Okay, so now that the entire model is chipped, I'll be using some AK brown and green camo panel liner to line the entire surface, and this will allow the entire surface to be very well defined and you can see every single detail. Alternatively, you can always use Agrax Earthshade for this stage. Just want to make sure that it gets into all the crevices. Yep, getting this all into the crevices. Then after that, I'm going to be using a clean sponge and I'm just going to wipe away the enamel panel liner that I have put on. One tip that I would like to give you guys when using enamel panel liners and enamel washers, what you want to do is the moment the paint is dry, you want to start wiping. You don't want to wait a couple of days to start doing this because the panel liner will really set really deep into the paint and you will find it really hard to wipe off. So now that the hull is panel line, we're going to be doing a little bit of dry brushing. This dry brushing is to pick out a little bit of the edges so that we can eventually make this terrain piece really stand out on the tabletop. You can see everything is coming together really nicely already. So now that the chipping is done, we're going to move on to creating the terrain. So for this stage, I'll be just using some texture paste to fill in some of the gaps and create this rough dirt texture that this predator is currently resting in. At this point of time, you can always gather around some relevant bits like dead space marines or other parts of your pile of greys so that you can get through your backlog even quicker. Alright, so let's get out all these materials and let's get making the base right now. Alright, so now I'm just going to be plotting on some texture paste. I'm going to be using AK Terrain Dry Ground and I'm just going to be putting it on the model. And at this point of time, if you don't have terrain paste, I recommend you to invest in it. Otherwise, you can always just use the good old PVA glue and sand. The color is not so important in this stage because I'm just using this for the texture and subsequently I will be coloring this differently. So next up, I'll be adding on some bits. These are parts of my old Space Marine army that I don't think that I will ever be painting. I apologize to them in advance for turning them into bits, just cutting them up and reposing them. So a bit of super glue, a bit of creativity, just want to pose them like dead bodies. And I know the joints kind of look awkward, but I'll be hiding the joints in more texture paste. This will make the anatomy look a little bit more realistic. See? There's a little bit of texture paste over the entire joint. I know this can be blasphemy for some modelers, but hell, this is just a terrain piece for me. So I just want to get this done quick. Trigger warning here. I think there's some people that will really be triggered by this side, but ain't nobody got time to be too neat for this stage, man. I just really want to create some immersive looking terrain for my Q Team games. So after that, I'll be priming these bits that I've added on in white. Because I'll be using some contrast paints, I want to do some small part separation, but in the ultimate scheme of things, these things will also be covered in pigments and you might not see them afterwards. But in my opinion, I think it's better off to just err on the safe side and just color them in first. You never know what you want to do later in the stages. So now that we've introduced some additional elements onto the model, let's move on to painting them. So for this stage, I'm just going to be using contrast paint to quickly paint them in. So for this chapter, I'll be using these contrast colors right here to paint out the elements on the base. Alright, let's get up all these colors and let's get painting the elements on the base right now. Alright, so now that the models have been primed white, I'm just going to be putting on some contrast paints to match the predator that these marines have died next to. I would say I'll just paint them in ultramarine colors. That's why I'm using the ultramarine contrast. Just trying to not get this on other parts of the models, but well, it's inevitable to get some of this blue paint on maybe the guns and other parts. But don't worry, because most of it will be covered in pigments. You don't really need to be that neat. So now I'm just doing more part separation, just using the basilicarium grey for the guns and the metal parts, as well as a little bit of plague barrier flash to base coat the casings on these Imperial Guard guns. Okay, so with contrast, you always want to overload the brush a little bit more. I know it sounds a little bit wasteful, but that's the whole point of contrast. You just want to save time. So here's just plague barrier flash, just to pick up little bits of the details. And these are the only 3 colors that I'll be using on the bits. I'm sorry that I don't think I'll be base coating the rest of the other elements, because I don't think they will really show up on the pigment wash that I'll be including soon. So now with the base elements done, I'm going to work on some details on the rhino itself. I'm going to be base coating several elements, so these are the colors that I'll be using. Alternatively, these colors will work just fine. So let's get up all these colors and let's get painting the details on the predator right now. So now I'm going to be doing some detailing. I know the base has already been washed in pigment here, but this detailing is just putting on some base coats to have some part separation on the model itself. So I'm just using oily steel to pick on some of the details. And just hang tight, because we'll be going on to the pigment wash that we'll be showing you how I did in the next step. So now here comes the fun part. So with all the base work done, we're going into heavy weathering so that we can make this entire piece look like a crazy rust bucket. So for this stage, I'll be using these materials right here. Let's get up all these materials and let's get weathering this predator right now. Alright, so now it's time for the pigment wash. I've diluted Vallejo pigment burnt umber into just plain old water, and I'm just slapping this paste all over the model. I find that if you use pigment washers, not only do they give you color, they give you very fine textures that you can't otherwise produce using texture paste. And this adds an additional element of scale to the entire model. So now once the whole thing is washed in pigment, I'm just going to give it a light dusting of European earth. At the bottom, I'll say 1/4 of the tank that is sort of buried in the dirt mold. As you can see, everything is coming together very nicely. And because these pigments are dry, it gives an entirely different look compared to when they are washed on. So now with more details, I'm using a sponge and a little bit of oily steel. I'm just going to be creating some chips on the edges to pick on the general form of the model so that this really stands out on the tabletop. Look at this, man, super fast, super easy. No real precision is needed on this entire project, and in my opinion, super gratifying. I really enjoyed this project, and I hope you give it a try too. So up next, I'm going to be using new rust as a wash, and I'm just focusing on areas with exposed metallic parts. I'm also going to be focusing on areas that might collect some water or might collect some dust over time. Judging that this is sort of like muddy, dry earth terrain, I would say that there is some precipitation, and looking at that, trying to put these paints near where water will be collected. Next, I'm going to be using fresh rust just to top up a little bit of the gaps. And yeah, this is starting to look really, really sweet. And there we have it. This is the Rust Bucket terrain piece that I produced from my very own Power of Grey. I feel so proud of myself. I've gotten rid of one more piece of plastic that I purchased long time ago. And I think you should give it a try because at the end of the day, let's face it, we are not going to be able to paint all our models that we have bought. But why not just use this as a palette cleanser? I really recommend this as an exercise between projects so that you can freshen up your eyes so that you can paint even better in the next project. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Remember, if you found this useful, give us a like and subscribe. This allows us to grow the channel and keep the lights on. Remember, if you want to support the channel even further, head on to the Patreon, become a Patreon today. I'd like to thank my patrons for allowing me to do this. And remember, if you'd like to hear any feedback from me, tag me on Instagram and I'll be happy to share my views with you. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I hope to see you in the next terrain painting video. See you.